The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic irony, had developed a peculiar sense of humor when it came to interstellar diplomacy. Take, for instance, the widely accepted fact that the most feared negotiators in known space weren't the razor-clawed Thrakari war merchants, the hive-minded collectorate with their thousand-year strategic planning, or even the crystalline Vorthak, who could literally read thoughts. No, the title of most likely to make you wet yourself during contract negotiations belonged to a species that had only joined the galactic community 3 decades ago and still couldn't figure out how to properly season their food without setting it on fire. Humans. The Terran Diplomatic Corps had earned this reputation through what historians would later call aggressive reasonableness. A paradoxical blend of charm, logic, and barely contained violence that made even the most hardened alien negotiators break out in whatever equivalent of cold sweats their biology provided. It wasn't that humans were inherently more intelligent or technologically advanced than their galactic neighbors. They simply had this disturbing habit of finding creative solutions to problems that usually involved someone else having a very bad day. Which brought us to the current situation aboard Kepler-7, a neutral trading station that orbited a particularly unremarkable star in the Veil sector. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, a sprawling complex of interlocking rings and docking bays that served as humanity's primary diplomatic hub in this corner of the galaxy. Today, it was hosting what the Zephyrian Empire had optimistically labeled the final solution to the human problem. The irony was not lost on anyone with a functioning sense of history. Ambassador Koreth Vex of the Zephyrian Empire adjusted his ceremonial throat sacs with what he hoped was confident authority. Around the curved conference table sat representatives from 7 major galactic powers, all united in their shared goal of putting these upstart humans in their proper place. The Manthari collective chittered anxiously through their translator units, their insectoid features betraying none of the confidence their words suggested. The Dulari Commonwealth's representative, a being that looked like someone had crossed a tree with a particularly philosophical octopus, swayed gently as it reviewed the terms they'd prepared. "Gentle beings," Koreth began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent considerable time practicing this speech in the mirror, "today we finally demonstrate that even the most challenging species can be brought to reasonable terms through proper preparation." The preparation in question was elegant in its simplicity. They had arranged for this meeting to be held in complete isolation. No outside communications, no weapons, no security details, no backup of any kind. The humans would send one representative, as was their custom, but this time they would be completely cut off from their support networks. No mysterious reinforcements, no sudden appearances by human Navy vessels. No convenient coincidences that somehow always seem to work in humanity's favor. Just one human, alone, vulnerable. It was, Koreth reflected with satisfaction, absolutely foolproof. The station's isolation protocols had been activated 2 hours ago, creating a perfect bubble of diplomatic immunity around the conference section. Nothing could get in, nothing could get out, and most importantly, no one could call for help. "The human representative should be arriving shortly," announced the station's AI in that peculiarly cheerful tone that artificial intelligence is used when delivering news that would probably ruin someone's day. "Commander Vera Chen of the Terran Diplomatic Corps has cleared security and is proceeding to Conference Chamber Alpha." Koreth's throat sacs practically vibrated with pleasure. Not only had they managed to isolate a human diplomat, but they'd gotten one of the notorious Chen family. The Chens had been involved in some of humanity's most successful negotiations, which made this victory all the sweeter. The chamber's main door hissed open with theatrical precision, and Commander Vera Chen walked in like she owned the place, which, given humanity's track record, she probably would by the time she left. Vera was unremarkable in the way that made seasoned diplomats immediately suspicious. Average height for a human, dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing the standard-issue diplomatic uniform that somehow managed to look both professional and vaguely threatening. She carried a single data pad and wore the kind of smile that suggested she was genuinely pleased to be there. That smile made Koreth's skin crawl. Gentle beings, Vera said, settling into the chair that had been designated for the human representative. Thank you for arranging this meeting. I have to say, the isolation protocols are quite impressive. Very thorough. There was something about the way she said thorough that made several of the alien representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Dulari Commonwealth's representative actually stopped swaying for a moment, which was the equivalent of a human holding their breath. Commander Chen, Koreth began, puffing up his throat sacs to their full, impressive diameter. We have called this meeting to discuss the revision of several trade agreements and territorial boundaries. As you can see, we represent a significant portion of this sector's economic and military power. Oh, I can see that, Vera agreed, glancing around the table with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. The Zephian Empire, the Manthari Collective, the Dulari Commonwealth, the Crystalline Hegemony, the Veltar Confederacy, the Outer Rim Consortium, and the Benthic League. That's what, about 60% of the local economic base? Very impressive coalition. The fact that she'd identified every faction present without consulting her datapad was noted by everyone in the room. The fact that she'd done it with the same tone someone might use to compliment a child's finger painting was noted by everyone with a functioning nervous system. Indeed, Koreth continued, trying to maintain his momentum. As you can see, you are somewhat outnumbered. Mathematically speaking, 7-1. Vera nodded. Though I have to ask, and please forgive my curiosity, how exactly did you manage to coordinate this coalition? I mean, the Crystalline Hegemony and the Veltar Confederacy have been in a state of what could charitably be called mutual economic antagonism for the past 12 years. The Manthari Collective's expansion policies are directly opposed to the Outer Rim Consortium's trade routes. And don't get me started on the philosophical differences between the Dulari Commonwealth and, well, everyone else. She paused, tilting her head slightly. It must have taken considerable effort to get everyone to agree to this. Koreth felt a small warning twinge in what humans would call his gut. We have put aside our differences in the interest of fair trade practices. Fair trade practices, Vera repeated, as if testing the words. That's a lovely phrase, very diplomatic. I assume you're referring to the 17 separate trade disputes that have been filed against human merchants in the past 6 months. Among other things, the Manthari representative clicked through its translator. Right, those other things. Vera consulted her datapad with the casual air of someone checking their grocery list. The territorial dispute over the Kepler-9 system, the mining rights in the Vale Nebula, the shipping lane taxes, the cultural contamination complaints, that's a new one by the way, I rather like it, and the general complaint that humans are, and I'm quoting here, insufficiently respectful of established galactic hierarchies. She looked up from her pad with that same pleasant smile. Did I miss anything? The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or someone getting thrown out of an airlock. Koreth found himself wishing he'd brought backup for his backup plan. Commander Chen, he said carefully, we have prepared a comprehensive proposal that we believe addresses all parties' concerns in a mutually beneficial manner. Ah, wonderful, Vera said, settling back in her chair. I do love a good proposal. Please, proceed. What followed was 47 minutes of the most elaborate diplomatic doublespeak that Koreth had ever personally witnessed. The coalition had prepared their terms with the meticulous care of a master chef preparing a poison dinner, every clause designed to look reasonable while slowly strangling human expansion in the sector. Vera listened with the attention of someone genuinely fascinated by the process. She took notes, she asked clarifying questions, she even complimented the elegance of some of their more creative restrictions. That's quite clever, she said when the Crystalline Hegemony representative finished explaining their proposed limitations on human mining operations. Restricting extraction to culturally significant stellar bodies, with cultural significance to be determined by a committee of, let me see, 7 members, none of whom are human. That's going to make asteroid mining rather interesting. He felt it was important to preserve the cultural heritage of the region. The crystalline representative buzzed through its translator. Absolutely, Vera agreed. Cultural preservation is vital. I'm curious though, Does this apply to the hegemony's current strip mining operations in the outer spiral? I mean, the Jakari consider those systems to be ancestral burial grounds, but I don't recall seeing any committee involvement there. The crystalline representative's light patterns shifted to what Koreth recognized as the equivalent of a human clearing their throat nervously. That is a different situation. Of course it is, Vera said with perfect sincerity. These things always are. It was about this time that Koreth began to suspect that something was going very wrong with their carefully laid plans. Commander Chen was being entirely too agreeable, too understanding, too human. Now, Vera continued, I have to say this is all very comprehensive. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. But I do have a few questions about implementation. The questions that followed were the kind that made experienced negotiators break out in cold sweats, not because they were particularly aggressive or hostile, but because they were so perfectly reasonable that they exposed every single flaw in the coalition's proposal with surgical precision. For instance, Vera said, consulting her notes, the proposed shipping lane taxes. The Outer Rim Consortium would be collecting fees from human vessels for passage through what are technically open space routes, but the consortium's authority over those routes is based on the Treaty of Vega Prime, which was signed in 2387, the same treaty that established the current borders of the Zephyr Empire. She looked up at Koreth with bright, interested eyes. I'm curious, does the Empire's current territorial expansion in the Cygnus Arm comply with those same treaty provisions? Koreth felt his throat sacs deflate slightly. The Empire's expansion is a separate matter. Is it though? Vera asked. Because according to the treaty, and I have a copy here if you'd like to review it, any territorial expansion by signatory powers requires approval from the original treaty parties. The Outer Rim Consortium was one of those parties. She turned to the consortium representative. Did you approve the Empire's expansion into the Cygnus Arm? The consortium representative, a being that looked like someone had crossed a crab with a filing cabinet, clicked its manipulator arms nervously. The expansion was a fait accompli. A fait accompli, Vera repeated. That's another lovely phrase. So, the Empire expanded without approval, the consortium didn't object because it was already done, and now both of you want to use the same treaty to restrict human shipping. That's consistent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Or maybe that was just the sudden realization that they weren't negotiating with a helpless human diplomat. They were negotiating with something much more dangerous. He prepared one. Commander Chen, the Manthari representative, chittered. These minor inconsistencies do not invalidate the broader principle of our proposal. Minor inconsistencies, Vera nodded. I love that phrase too. You know, the Manthari Collective has always been excellent with language, very precise, very careful about meaning. She consulted her datapad again. Speaking of precision, I notice that your proposal includes restrictions on human aggressive colonization practices. Could you define what constitutes aggressive colonization? The Manthari representative's mandibles clicked in what Koreth recognized as the equivalent of a human grimace. Settlement of inhabited systems without proper consultation with existing populations. Existing populations, Vera repeated. Like the fringe worlds? The silence that followed was so complete that Koreth could hear his own circulatory system pumping. The fringe worlds were a collection of marginally habitable planets that the Manthari had been systematically strip mining for the past 50 years. The original inhabitants had been relocated to more suitable worlds, which was diplomatic speak for places where they couldn't complain about the environmental damage. The fringe world situation is a historical matter, the Manthari representative finally managed. Historical, Vera agreed, like the Dulari Commonwealth's current philosophical guidance programs in the Theta sector, or the Benthic League's resource-sharing initiatives in the deep ocean systems, all very historical. She looked around the table with the same bright, interested expression. It's fascinating how many historical situations we have in this room. It's almost like there's a pattern. Koreth felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead ridges. This was not how this was supposed to go. The human was supposed to be isolated, outnumbered, and forced to accept their terms. Instead, she was systematically dismantling 30 years of carefully constructed diplomatic fiction with the casual efficiency of someone untying shoelaces. "Commander Chen," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "While these historical precedents are interesting, they don't change the current situation. You are here alone, without support, to negotiate terms that will affect human expansion throughout this sector." "That's true," Vera agreed. "Very alone, very isolated. No backup, no weapons, no support." She paused, her smile becoming slightly more pronounced. "It's almost like you planned it that way." The way she said it made Koreth's skin crawl. Again. "We simply felt it was important to have an environment free from outside influences," he said carefully. "Outside influences?" Vera nodded. "Like the possibility of human reinforcements arriving at an inconvenient moment, or communication with the Terran diplomatic corps, or any of those other annoying habits humans have of not being quite as helpless as they appear." She leaned forward slightly, and somehow that small movement made every being in the room want to lean back. "You know, isolation protocols are fascinating things. They're designed to keep outside influences from interfering with diplomatic processes. Very effective. Very thorough." There was that word again, thorough. Koreth was beginning to hate that word. "But here's the thing about isolation protocols," Vera continued, her tone remaining perfectly conversational. "They work both ways. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Which means that right now we're all trapped in here together until someone decides to lift the protocols." "The protocols will be lifted when we conclude our negotiations," Koreth said, though he was beginning to suspect that this statement was more hope than certainty. "Will they?" Vera asked. "Because I have to ask, who exactly has the authority to lift them?" The question hung in the air like a small, perfectly timed explosive device. Koreth suddenly realized that he didn't actually know the answer. The protocols had been set up by the station's AI, acting on the collective authority of the coalition members, but the specific mechanism for lifting them— "The protocols are automated," the Dulari Commonwealth representative said, its voice carrying the sound of someone who had just realized they might have made a terrible mistake. "They lift when all parties agree to conclude negotiations." "All parties," Vera repeated, "including the human representative." "Including the human representative," the Dulari confirmed. "That's wonderful," Vera said, her smile becoming positively radiant. "So I have veto power over when this meeting ends. That's convenient." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. Several of the coalition representatives were beginning to look like they were seriously reconsidering their life choices. "Commander Chen," Koreth said carefully, "surely you don't intend to hold us here indefinitely?" "Oh no," Vera said, looking genuinely shocked at the suggestion. "That would be terribly rude. I'm sure we can conclude our business in a reasonable time frame. I just want to make sure we cover all the important points." She consulted her datapad again, humming quietly to herself. "Let's see. We've covered the trade restrictions, the territorial limitations, the cultural preservation requirements, the shipping taxes, and the various historical precedents, but I don't think we've really addressed the core issue." "Which is?" the crystalline hegemony representative asked, its light pratnatas shifting to what Koreth recognized as deep unease. "The assumption that humans are a problem that needs to be solved," Vera said simply. The silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that occurred when someone had just stated something so obvious that everyone else realized they'd been thinking around it for months without ever addressing it directly. "I mean," Vera continued, "that's what this is really about, isn't it? The trade disputes, the territorial conflicts, the cultural complaints. They're all symptoms of a bigger concern. The concern that humans are changing the established order in ways that make everyone uncomfortable." She looked around the table, meeting each representative's eyes in turn. "The concern that maybe, just maybe, humans are a little too good at this whole galactic civilization thing. We have legitimate grievances," the Manthari representative protested. Oh, absolutely, Vera agreed. Completely legitimate. The question is whether those grievances are about what humans are doing, or about the fact that humans are doing it at all. She turned to Koreth. For instance, the Zephyrian Empire's complaint about human expansion in the Cygnus Arm. Are you concerned about the expansion itself, or about the fact that human colonies are more successful than Zephyrian ones? Koreth felt his throat sacs tighten. That is a gross oversimplification. Is it? Vera asked. Because human colonies in the Cygnus Arm have a 94% success rate. Zephyrian colonies have a 67% success rate. The difference is significant enough that several Zephyrian worlds have actually requested human administrative assistance. She consulted her datapad again. 3 worlds to be specific, which is why the Empire filed a complaint about cultural contamination, because your own people prefer human management techniques. The look on Koreth's face was the expression of someone who had just realized they were holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. Or take the Manthari Collective's concerns about human colonization practices, Vera continued. Are you worried about the practices themselves, or about the fact that human colonies consistently outperform Manthari settlements in terms of sustainability, economic growth, and citizen satisfaction? The Manthari representative's mandibles clicked frantically. Human methods are unconventional. They're effective, Vera corrected, which is why the collective has been quietly adopting human agricultural techniques for the past 5 years. Not officially, of course, but the yield improvements in the outer territories are pretty hard to miss. She moved on to the next representative with the methodical precision of someone checking items off a list. The Dulari Commonwealth's philosophical concerns about human intellectual contamination are those about protecting Dulari culture, or about the fact that increasing numbers of young Dulari are choosing human steel education systems? Our culture is ancient and revered, the Dulari representative protested, its swaying becoming more agitated. It is, Vera agreed. It's also producing graduates who can't compete in the modern galactic economy, which is why Commonwealth universities have been quietly hiring human professors and adopting human curricula for the past 3 years. By this point, the representatives were beginning to look like they were attending their own funeral, which, Koreth reflected, they probably were. The pattern, Vera continued, is pretty clear. Humans aren't just successful. They're successful in ways that make everyone else's traditional approaches look inadequate. And that's uncomfortable. She leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming almost sympathetic. I get it, really. Nobody likes feeling like they're being shown up by the new kids. It's natural to want to find ways to level the playing field. Then you understand our position, Koreth said hopefully. Oh, I understand it perfectly, Vera said. The question is whether you understand mine. The way she said it made everyone in the room suddenly wish they were somewhere else. Anywhere else. Preferably somewhere with better security and fewer isolated humans. You see, Vera continued, you've made a fundamental error in your calculations. You've assumed that human success is somehow accidental, that we're just lucky or reckless or benefiting from some kind of cosmic coincidence. She stood up slowly, and the simple action somehow made the room feel much smaller. You've assumed that if you could just isolate us, cut us off from our support networks, force us to negotiate from a position of weakness, then you could put us back in our proper place. Is not, Koreth began. It is exactly what this is, Vera interrupted, and for the first time her voice carried an edge. You've trapped me in here with you, thinking that one isolated human diplomat would be helpless against a coalition of 7 galactic powers. She walked around the table slowly, her hands clasped behind her back. But here's what you didn't consider. What if human success isn't accidental? What if we're not just lucky or reckless? What if we're actually good at this? The question hung in the air like a small, perfectly timed explosive device. Again. What if, Vera continued, the reason human colonies are more successful is because we've developed better colonization techniques? What if the reason human diplomats are feared throughout the galaxy is because we've gotten really, really good at understanding how other species think. What if the reason you're all so uncomfortable with human expansion is because you've finally met a species that's better at galactic civilization than you are? She completed her circuit of the table and returned to her chair. What if you haven't trapped a helpless human diplomat in here with you? What if you've trapped yourselves in here with something much worse? Which is, the Veltar Confederacy representative asked, though its tone suggested it really didn't want to know the answer. A human diplomat who came prepared, Vera said simply. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. Several of the coalition representatives were beginning to exhibit the telltale signs of beings who had just realized they'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. You see, Vera continued, settling back into her chair, you've spent so much time focusing on what humans don't have, the weapons, the backup, the support networks, that you've forgotten what we do have. She tapped her datapad. Information, analysis, understanding, the ability to see patterns that others miss, the capacity to find weaknesses in seemingly strong positions, and the knowledge, she added, her smile returning, that every single one of you has more to lose from a prolonged conflict than humans do. Koreth felt his throat sacs deflate completely. What do you mean? Vera said, consulting her datapad again, that the Zephyri Empire's economy is dependent on trade routes that pass through human-controlled space. The Manthari Collective's new expansion is funded by loans from human banks. The Dulari Commonwealth's cultural preservation programs are supported by human academic institutions. The Crystalline Hegemony's recent technological advances are based on human research. The Veltar Confederacy's military upgrades use human design systems. The Outer Rim Consortium's shipping efficiency depends on human logistics software, and the Benthic League's environmental restoration projects are managed by human conservation specialists. She looked up from her pad with that same bright, interested expression. In other words, you're all more dependent on human cooperation than you'd like to admit, which makes this isolation protocol particularly interesting. Interesting how? The Outer Rim Consortium representative asked, though its tone suggested it really didn't want to know. Well, Vera said, while we're all trapped in here, unable to communicate with the outside world, what do you think is happening to all those systems that depend on human cooperation? The question hit the room like a small, perfectly timed nuclear device. Every representative suddenly realized that they had various time-sensitive operations, agreements, and systems that required human input to function properly. The trade routes, Koreth whispered. The loan payments, the Manthari representative chittered. The cultural exchange programs, the Dulari representative moaned. The research projects, the Crystalline representative buzzed. The military systems, the Veltar representative groaned. The logistics networks, the Outer Rim representative clicked. The environmental programs, the Benthic representative gurgled. Exactly, Vera said cheerfully. And since we're all isolated here, with no way to communicate with the outside world, there's no way to manage any of those situations until someone decides to lift the protocols. She leaned forward slightly. The question is, how long do you think your respective governments will wait before they start wondering why their critical systems are failing and their representatives aren't responding to communications? The representatives looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were calculating exactly how long they had before their careers ended in spectacular fashion. Of course, Vera continued, there is a simple solution to this problem. Which is? Koreth asked desperately. We conclude our negotiations quickly and amicably, Vera said. I'm authorized to offer a comprehensive trade agreement that addresses all legitimate concerns while maintaining the current trajectory of human expansion. The terms are quite reasonable. She produced a data crystal from her pocket and placed it on the table. Full trade reciprocity, technology sharing agreements, cultural exchange programs, and mutual defense provisions, plus compensation for any economic disruptions caused by this meeting. Compensation? The Manthari representative asked. For the various systems that are currently failing while we're isolated here, Vera explained. The Terran Diplomatic Corps has a very generous policy regarding damages caused by unnecessary diplomatic delays. She consulted her datapad one more time. According to my calculations, we've been here for approximately 3 hours. Current accumulated costs for trade route disruptions, delayed loan payments, suspended research projects, and various other time-sensitive issues are running at about, let's see, 2.7 million credits per hour. The number hit the room like a small, perfectly timed financial apocalypse. Per hour, Vera repeated helpfully, accumulating interest at standard galactic rates. That's extortion, the Christian representative managed. That's consequences, Vera corrected. You chose to implement isolation protocols that cut off communication with critical systems. I'm simply pointing out the cost of that choice. She stood up again, smoothing down her uniform. Now, I'm prepared to recommend acceptance of the current terms, which would lift the protocols and allow everyone to get back to managing their various crises. Or, we can continue negotiating until you're all comfortable with the arrangement. How long would that take? Koreth asked weakly. Oh, I'm very thorough, Vera said, and there was that word again. I'd say minimum of 12 hours to properly address all the concerns that have been raised. Possibly longer if we need to discuss historical precedents in detail. The representatives looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were performing rapid mental calculations involving career prospects, economic damage, and the probability of surviving their respective governments' reactions to this fiasco. The terms, the Dulari representative said finally, are they reasonable? Extraordinarily reasonable, Vera assured them. Full reciprocity, mutual benefit, respect for cultural differences, and a framework for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than creative isolation protocols. And the compensation? The Manthari representative asked. Waved. Provided we conclude within the next hour, Vera said graciously. I'm authorized to treat this as a learning experience rather than a deliberate disruption of critical systems. The vote was unanimous, not because the terms were particularly favorable to the coalition, but because the alternative was explaining to 7 different governments why their representatives had managed to cripple their own economies while trying to intimidate a single human diplomat. The isolation protocols were lifted, the trade agreements were signed, the various time-sensitive systems were restored to normal operation. And Commander Vera Chen walked out of Conference Chamber Alpha with the same casual attitude she'd arrived with, leaving behind a room full of representatives who had just learned a very expensive lesson about the dangers of underestimating human diplomacy. Later, when the coalition members were asked to explain exactly what had happened during the negotiations, their reports were remarkably consistent. They all mentioned the fear, the growing realization that they had not trapped a helpless human diplomat with them, but rather had trapped themselves with something much more dangerous. A human who had come prepared. The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic irony, had indeed developed a sense of humor about interstellar diplomacy, and the joke, as it turned out, was on anyone who thought that isolation protocols were a good way to deal with the species that had turned diplomatic immunity into an art form. No weapons, no backup, no support. Just fear in their eyes when she spoke. And honestly, that was all she'd ever needed.